Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this. I won't even call it a conference or a seminar. It's just sort of, and the idea is to discuss some elements of a relationship between two countries, which has great importance for India. Namely, we are going to talk about Russia-China relations. And what we are going to do is we are going to have Nivedita present to us what her view of the Russian perspective of this relationship. Then Professor Kondapalli will tell us about what he thinks is the Chinese view of it. And then we are going to ask Mr. Mukerji to try and suggest to us what is India's view of this relationship and where we are at this moment of time. The reason I, at least personally, was provoked to have this particular discussion was that recently participating in a discussion on Russia-China relations in Delhi, I discovered that learned members of our strategic community had really very little clue about how Russia and China view each other, and but had huge opinions on how bad Russia and China were. So I think, I mean, none of them unfortunately are here, but this would have been an educative process for them. I think I've said enough, and with that, let's get down to our discussion. Nivedita, floor is yours.
So the topic of my discussion, as you can see, is Russian perspective on Russia-China relations. So my aim has been to look at what have been the developments in the Russia-China relationship. And then I look at, apart from the official position, I try and understand how the Russian scholarly community, the think tank community, the analysts, how do they view this emerging Russia-China relationship? So this is just a quick timeline. I'm not going to spend much time on this. As you can see that the Russia-China relationship did not suddenly become important. It has been a steady process of development. So when Boris Yeltsin visited China in 1992, it was seen as a historical breakthrough. In 1994, when President Jiang Zemin visited Russia, it was the first visit by Chinese president after 57 years. So you can see that right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the new post-Soviet Russia started its engagement with China. So in 1994, we saw that the western border of Russia and China was demarcated. Both the countries decided that they will not use, no first use of nuclear weapons against each other. In 96, their relationship was upgraded to strategic partnership. In 97, a major sticking point during the Soviet period about troops on the Russia-China border, that was reduced. So we can see steadily developments have been taking place that have improved the Russia-China relationship. At the same time, there were several regional and international developments that were pushing these two countries closer, in the sense that Russia's interactions with the West were not developing in terms of building a rapprochement. For example, there were a lot of differences. The major sticking point was NATO expansion eastward. There was the issue of missile defense in Eastern Europe. So all of these, there were other issues of US intervention in Iran, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Libya. Then earlier it was in Yugoslavia. So there were several areas where Russia and the United States were differing from each other. So all of this culminated and strengthened the Russia-China relationship, particularly after 2014. So once the groundwork had been laid, and when the 2014 Ukrainian crisis happened, and Russia's relationship with the West reached at a new post-Cold War low, that was the time when the Russia-China relationship entered a new phase of its development. So that now I look at how the post-2014 world has shaped up and how the Russian community inside Russia is looking at this relationship. So it's not just strategic dimension after 2014, it's political dimension, it's economic dimension, and strategic dimension in the post-2014 period. So Western scholars have often said that this Russia-China relationship has just been an axis of convenience. But what has been very clear after 2014 that it has moved much beyond that axis of convenience. So the main issue here has been that not just there has been a steady improvement of ties over the years, Russia has realized that China has never sought to impose its ideas on Russia, something that it does not think that the West has done. Also, Russia says that, or Russia believes that West was only offering it what is it has called a subordinate position. It was not offering it a partnership of equals. So that has been a major problem with Russia, which it has not seen in its relationship with China. So if you see, this change in the relationship has also been reflected in the foreign policy concept of the Russian Federation, which is which is signed by the president of the Russian Federation. When in 2000, both the countries said that they want to develop mutually advantageous relationship, but at the same time they said that the scale of the economic cooperation has to be brought in line with that of the political interaction. In 2008, it was much the same language that we saw in the Russian foreign policy concept, but coming down to 2016, we can see a clear shift in this foreign policy concept language itself, because from trying to worrying about the economic interaction between the two countries, Russia clearly said that Russia and China should develop common principled approach, and these common principled approaches are key to maintaining regional and global stability. So, and these have not just been empty words. The foreign policy concept has actually been reflected in the developments on the ground. So first I'll look at the economic ties, how the economic ties are developed. This is the Russia-China bilateral trade. In 2018, it crossed $108 billion, which made China Russia's largest trade partner. So what does this actually mean in terms of percentage of trade? Here also you can see there's been steady development of economic ties. This means if you look at share of China in Russia's exports, it has been rising. It is the blue line that has crossed, it's about at 11%. What is the share of Russia share of China in Russian imports? It is the red line at the top that has shot up. So it's around about 21%. But if you look at the reverse case, what's the share of Russia in Chinese exports? It's the last line from the bottom. So it's still at a very low level, both in terms of share of Russia in Chinese exports and the share of Russia in Chinese exports, which again you see is the last line from the bottom. Russia mostly exports natural gas, wood, paper, these kind of stuff, and it mostly imports manufactured goods from China. So this is the economic relationship that has prompted Russian experts within Russia to say that we are worried not about the possibility of conflict between Russia and China. What we're worried about is the developing asymmetry in this economic relationship. Mainly it is because they worry that if Russia's economic decline does not correct itself, it will impede its ability to play in the top league. And it would also impede its ability to diversify its relationships with other countries other than China. So how does that affect Russia's position in building a multipolar world, which Russia does want to develop? So that is the main concern of the Russian analysts. So they say that Russia needs to improve the quality of its ties with China, and it needs to diversify its ties across the board. But at the same time, the same Russian analysts also say that this does not mean that there's no political or strategic combination in our relationship. So even though the economic ties are an issue of concern for the Russian analysts, they say that there's a lot of strategic balance that we can strike with each other. So for example, in the energy relationship, if you see, Russia surpassed Saudi Arabia to become China's leading crude oil exporter in 2016. In 2014, just a few months after the Ukrainian crisis, Russia and China struck the largest ever natural gas deal. It was a $400 billion Power of Siberia deal, and it came online on December 2nd, just last week. So what this means is that Russia is committing increasing amounts of its energy, oil and gas to China. While Russia has already said that it does want to expand both its oil and gas exports to Asia, what we see is not so much of a diversification to Asia, but mostly to China. So this is with regards to energy exports. There's another interesting development that has been happening in the energy field. Earlier, the Chinese investment in strategic sectors like oil and gas was not encouraged by Russia, but that has changed out in 2014 because China has acquired stake in 2 Russian oil and gas fields, which is Yamal LNG and Arctic LNG. So this is a new development, and Russian analysts believe that this has happened because the confrontation with the West weakened the voice of the skeptics in the Kremlin. By 2015, Russia and China decided that they will coordinate on 2 of their most ambitious projects, which is the Eurasian Economic Union, building of Greater Eurasia, and China's One Belt, One Road. While the 2 sides have not actually said how are they going to operationalize this, But what the Russian scholarly community believes that after 2014, Russia decided that the benefits of cooperating with with China on this far exceed the risks that are involved. Now I'll come to the defense relationship that has again been growing between the two parties. So since this is a cumulative figure from 1992 to 2018. I've looked at the cumulative figures. China imported arms worth about $35 billion. India, if you compare, since 92, we have imported from Russia about $39 billion. This is a figure from 2000 to 2018. So China is the orange line that you see. So if you look at it closely, after 2014, there has been a slight increase in the Russian exports to China, but it has not been, it's not shot up like it's in the 2003 or 2004 when you see it's crossing billions of dollars. But what is important here is not the amount of exports, arms export, but the quality of what is being exported. So two have been most important in terms of S-400 and the Sukhoi 35s. Both of these, as Russian analysts point out, affect the balance of power in East Asia. They impact the ability of the Taiwanese Air Force to defend Taiwan. And as well as if US wants to come in, it will also impede US ability to protect Taiwan. So it's this, before 2014, Russia had never sold China its most advanced weaponry in this sense. And it is this, its ability to, through its arms sales, to change the balance of power in the region, which now it is doing in favor of China, that is of concern. So the pivot to the east, many analysts will point out, it did not begin in 2014. What happened after 2014 was that it was strengthened remarkably. But neither of those, or neither of the two countries want to enter into an alliance relationship with each other because they understand that A, it will spook other countries. Also, it's not in the interest of either country to get into an alliance partnership at this stage, especially Russia, where analysts would point out that Russia understands that it will only be a junior partner relationship with China, an alliance relationship with China. Hence, it wants to maintain a cooperative partnership, but it does not want to enter into an alliance with China. What has happened after 2014 is, as a result of all these developments that I pointed out to you, there's a new strategic context to the Russia-China relationship. And it is this strategic concept that will impact Russia's two of the most important foreign policy directions that it wants to take, development of Greater Eurasia and its pivot to Asia. And it is precisely because of this reason that other countries need to start paying attention to how Russia and China are coming together on these issues. At the same time, this is also a period where Russia has been developing its Greater Eurasia initiative. So how does all of this help China? So China understands that Russia, when it cooperates with China, it adds to its foreign policy value. In terms of, for China, it is not about the economic partnership. That is not the central thrust of its relationship. Why China needs Russia is to strengthen its foreign policy partnership at the global level, because at the international level, Russia is still a lot more active as compared to China. Also, both these countries, they cooperate with each other on strategic issues. They lend support to each other. For instance, on the issue of Indo-Pacific, Russia came out and said that this is an American concept which is trying to contain China, which is clearly siding with China on this issue, even though it talked about ASEAN centrality later on. On the South China Sea, on the East China Sea, Russia has maintained a neutral stance. Similarly, on Crimea, China, while it has not openly supported Russia, it also abstained from a UNSC resolution that would have condemned the Crimean annexation. So on these strategic issues, where both the countries, which are very crucial for both these countries, they're supporting each other, and this lends them a weight at the international level, and China understands that, the importance of that. Also, there's an important issue of how, if there was a US-Russia rapprochement, how that would create fears in China of a strategic encirclement. And because that is not happening, that is of great relief to China. So that's another important issue that we need to keep in mind. Also, the talk of rift, analysts, Western analysts, they talk about how Russia is worried about the Chinese takeover of the Russian Far East, or how these two countries are going to clash in Central Asia. But those rifts, the expectation of those rifts have not materialized, and which is what has led Russian analysts to conclude that West now needs to understand that this rapprochement is serious and it is not going away anytime soon. Also, in Russia, there's now a broad understanding that the confrontation with the West, in terms of the kind of sanctions that have been imposed, that they will continue for a long time. They're not just going to suddenly disappear because there's a change of government in the United States. So this is also why the centrality of China is now being felt so keenly in the Russian expert community. Also, the kind of disagreements that Russia has with the West, they are core disagreements about regional issues, world issues. The kind of issues that it has with China, they are not antagonistic in nature, and they can be resolved. That's the sense among the Russians. That's also a difference that we need to see in these two different relationships. Also, because the world attention is turning towards Asia because of the rise of different powers, it's only natural that Russia will also try to move towards Asia. And in this, it will interact with China, and a closer relationship with China would impact its overall policy towards both Eurasia and in its pivot to Asia. So in conclusion, I would say, based on all the various readings of Russian analysts and the official developments, we can say that Russia's conflict with the West is set to continue, and their deep disagreements are also set to continue. Russia is worried that if it interacts with Europe, it will never be an equal partner. It will always be seen as a junior partner. And at this stage, it does not have enough power to force itself to become an equal partner in Europe as well. So it is turning its attention to other policy directions. And this rapprochement is not just about these bilateral relationships. It's also about how broader changes in world politics are impacting the Russia-China relationship and how Russia sees its position in the world. This Russia, it has strengthened itself economically, militarily, and now it wants to reassert itself and is looking for strong partners to do that. And that it has found that partner in China. If I'll conclude all of that, the Russian analysts believe that because of all the developments that I've cited before this, these ties, the Russia-China ties, will continue to be independent of the Russia-West relationship. So even if what they say is there's nothing that the West can offer Russia at this stage that would make Russia come away from China and again build a rapprochement with the West. So that is the sense that I'm getting from studying both the Russian official sources and the Russian analysts. But there's a point of caution in all the Russian scholars who say that it's important for Russia to find the right balance in the relationship. It should not become a sidekick to China, and that is a process that is essentially socio-economic in nature. It's not only political. It is for Russia to reform itself, carry out structural reforms within itself, so as to be able to not just be a strong partner alongside China, but also diversify its relations with other countries, and that would help in Russia to build a multipolar world order. And they also do not see the prospect of Russia being dominated by China. They believe that Russia will be able to carve a space for itself because of the legacy it holds, and also because of the actions that it has taken over the past years to strengthen itself. So the embrace of China looks set to continue. And these two countries, they don't think they will be against each other, even if, as Dmitry Trendon has always said, that they will not be always for each other, but they'll not be against each other. Thank you.
Thank you, Nivedita. I think that was a fairly succinct summation of Russia's relationship with China post-91. There were attempts actually at improving the relationship even earlier by the Soviets. I think Shrikant is going to mention some of those, but let me leave you with this thought. As Mr. Mukerji reminded me, it was Mr. Gorbachev who was walking around Tiananmen Square when the students were protesting. Okay, Shrikant, take it from there.
Thank you, Nandan. A very good morning to you all. I think Nivedita had covered most of the subjects, so let me look at from the Chinese perspective of the developments in relation to Russia. Well, this is the 70th anniversary of bilateral relations between the two countries. There were many articles which were written recently by the Chinese, and one of the most prominent one is by Deputy Foreign Minister Liu Yun, who also served in New Delhi as an ambassador before. And many of you may have also recalled him for his comments on the RCEP. When India did not join the RCEP in Bangkok meeting, he said, without India, we'll go ahead with the RCEP with the 15 partners. Anyway, Liu Yun wrote an article on the commemorating the 70th anniversary of the bilateral relations with Moscow. He mentioned that there are trials and tribulations in the bilateral relations. He divides these prospects between China and Russia into 4 aspects: global, strategic, systemic, interesting content in the bilateral relations. But he also mentions about the spontaneous coming together or coordination. He uses the word coordination in many of the aspects. So we know, of course, the China-Russia relations in terms of the global and strategic perspective. They've been together since the fall of the Soviet Union, roughly, and as well as since the strategic partnership has been agreed to. But the interesting comments were on the systemic coordination as well as spontaneous. This spontaneous thing we looked at from Syria, from Libya, from North Korea, from various other regional security issues, on Iran, on a number of issues. So there's been a spontaneous reaction from the 2 Security Council members. On Iraq, on Afghanistan, many resolutions they have been able to coordinate with each other. On Myanmar Saffron Revolution, there was also the counter from the Russians and the Chinese simultaneously on this issue. And again, on the colored revolutions, the Tulip Revolution, Orange Revolution, all those that affected the Eurasian region, there's also been a lot of coordination among them. So it indicates to a certain path in the foreign policy dimensions of these 2 countries. To divide these 70 years, there are 4 phases we can look at. One is the leaning to one side period in 1949 till about 1962. Leaning to one side, so Mao Zedong decided that they have no friends. Only about 50 countries have recognized China at the time. And so they need to lean towards the Soviet Union. So they lean toward the Soviet Union, and 156 major industrial projects have been commissioned in China. Suddenly, a peasant-based country transformed itself into a modern country. 42 of these agreements are related to the military areas, including in the nuclear field. Since 1956, there's been substantial cooperation between China and the then Soviet Union in the nuclear field as well. Uranium prospecting, designs for the nuclear weapons. In fact, some commentators mentions this as the large-scale, whole-scale, horizontal transfers of the WMD technologies in human history we have seen during that period. Of course, differences came up based on national interests, ideological, and related to as well the contextual differences resulted in what the Chinese called the Soviets as social imperialists in the 1960s. There was huge criticism and also a number of movements against the Soviets. During the Cold War, this has also resulted in Nixon's visit to China and China working together with the US for the downfall of the Soviet Union. One of the 3 main elements of China-US coordination after Nixon's visit was, number 1, how China can be risen through technological market economy, FDI, a whole set of things. Second, in terms of their understanding on Taiwan. And third, most important as well, on the Soviet disintegration. This aspect generally is not mentioned in open, but the NATO did give open briefings to Mao Zedong at that point of time in the 70s on countering the Soviets. And the Soviets were also raising a lot of military, for instance, the Okean 1976 ocean-based military exercise the Soviets carried on that time was quite spectacular, and the Chinese were having trouble with this aspect. The fourth, of course, is, as Nivedita mentioned, the strategic partnership, which is reflected in what we have seen in terms of their coordination. However, there are differences in terms of national interests. China has been keen that Russia do not develop relations with Taiwan or do not have contacts with the Dalai Lama. There was a suggestion for giving visa to the Dalai Lama, and China put various spikes in this. Third, on South China Sea, there is a lot of differences of opinion between the Russians and the Chinese on this. Russians support the Vietnamese in this, and the Russian actions in South China Sea, although conducive to China in the light of the PCA ruling, Permanent Court of Arbitration, ruling in July 2016, yet this is an aspect which it has not come out into the open, but nevertheless there is trouble on the bilateral national interest perspective on the South China Sea. Remember the Russian deputy foreign minister's visit, after that the visit by the Chinese foreign minister indicates how Vietnam still is a factor in the Russia-China relations substantially on that count. So on the national interests, the Taiwan, the core interest, as the Chinese say, is still a problematic area, and this is subsumed under the overall. Likewise, for the Russians, as Nivedita mentioned about the Crimea situation and Abkhazia, South Ossetia related, there is a nuanced position that Chinese took in the SCO meetings in the final declarations that peace should prevail, nobody should use force, comments which appear to be more equidistant rather than supportive of Russia on the Georgia, Crimea related events. So there are some differences of opinion on the national interest perspective. In the late 1980s, as Nandan mentioned, there was the normalization that happened. Gorbachev's speech in Vladivostok 1986 was the turning point for the Sino-Russian Soviet relations at that time. Deng Xiaoping imposed 3 conditions on Russia, Soviet Union, for normalization. One is withdrawal of troops from the northern borders. There are some 36 divisions mobilized by the Soviets, increased to about 46 divisions during the Sino-Soviet conflict in 1969, including about 300 SS series of ballistic missiles to counter China. And Soviet Union wanted to nuke China at that time in the border clashes on Chenpao Tao Islands. So one condition is withdrawal of troops. Nothing really happened except the Soviet Union itself disintegrated, and they were reconfiguring towards the Western Front, European front. The second condition was withdrawal from Afghanistan. As you know, between 79 to 89, there was the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, and so this was a precondition for normalization. Soviets did not withdraw because of the Chinese demand, but because of the larger Cold War issues, the Mujahideen and the 60,000 Soviet troops dead in Afghanistan. The third condition is do not help Vietnam on the Indo-China related issues, that is Laos, Cambodia. On this issue as well, there was no progress. There was the Cambodian peace process that happened, but nevertheless, the Soviets did not yield. What clinched for the Chinese is the Soviet disintegration in 1991. So we need to keep that in mind. Chinese analysts say that the Chinese and the Russians were able to cobble up together in the last 2 decades because of the elimination of gap in ideology, that the Russians and Chinese got together because there is that coordination on various issues, and there was the leadership ability to resolve many bilateral issues, or at least not discuss these in public. So since 2013, the Chinese have mentioned in their foreign policy about a new type of major power relations. This is a new concept in Chinese foreign policy. They think they are a major power. And of course they are, because with $14 trillion, second largest economy, third largest military force, obviously they are the largest. But what is important is the differential treatment towards the US, with which they actually cobbled up the new type of major power relations. The Sunnylands meeting between Obama and Xi Jinping. In this, they have a non-confrontational, non-conflict, win-win stable relations. But in the case of Russia, it is non-aligned. Russia-China relations, the Chinese see as non-aligned, non-confrontational. Obviously, there is not much confrontation between Russia and China. And third, non-targeting a third country, or Sino-Russian relations are not against any third country. The Chinese keep stressing this because they do not want Russia-China relations to acquire an anti-American flavor. While the Russians want to push this into a kind of military alliance. For example, in the BRICS meetings, the Russian policy analysts keep suggesting that BRICS should form a military alliance against the West, against the US and Europe and so on. The Chinese keep a caution on this because they do not want to be a target like the Soviet Union became a target of the US. So to that extent, I think there is a nuanced position they have on, I think it is reflected in what Nivedita mentioned as a kind of united front. Chinese foreign policy issues should be seen in a Maoist perspective, that is, the Chinese keep deflecting any conflict with any other major country, learning lessons from the Soviet disintegration, that they do not want to be a target of the US or other major powers. And hence the united front, and this is useful for us also to understand the Chennai Connect or Wuhan spirit or others. Whenever there is trouble brewing for China, they do fan out. And early next year, Xi Jinping is visiting Shinzo Abe in Japan, also for this united front tactics. So I think the larger perspective is this united front. Whenever the Chinese are in trouble in general, and they are in trouble right now, because the NSS, the National Security Strategy of the US, as well as the QDR, renamed as the Defense Strategy of the US, mentions China and Russia are the targets of the current administration. So there is this united front keep popping up in their foreign policy. Broadly, the Chinese foreign policy has these 5 elements since the 18th and 19th Party Congresses. One is relations with major powers, and obviously Russia is a major power. In comprehensive national power terms, it is number 2, while its GDP is below $2 trillion, and Chinese GDP is about $14 trillion. Yet in comprehensive national power conditions, Russia is still number 2 on various resources and various other. So relations with major powers, relations with neighbors, which Russia is a neighbor. Third, developing countries, multilateralism, also sometimes in multipolar terms, as Nivedita mentioned. The 19th Party Congress mentioned about multipolarity accelerating. In other words, Chinese foreign policy is directed on these multipolar related. So BRICS, SEO, various other United Nations Security Council coordination, various issues on Syria, Iran, and so this is another. And the 5th element in Chinese foreign policy is related to soft power and enhancement. On this, there is a certain blockade from Russia. For example, Russians think that the WeChat is snooping on them. The social networking sites that the Chinese are building have gadgets which would be not conducive to the Russian security. So there is some restrictions on the social networking sites operation in Russia. I would divide the bilateral relations into 6 main aspects. One is the territorial dispute resolution. Very important because once the dispute has been resolved by the 1990s, mid-1990s, China was relieved. Millions of troops have been repositioned towards Taiwan, South China Sea, towards India as well. So the border agreement with Russia was very conducive for them in order to disperse all these troops, a major decision. And I think the territorial dispute resolution under the mutual understanding, mutual benefit principle from a Chinese perspective resulted in a lot of stability on the border areas. Most important, they withdrew troops from Mongolia, Outer Mongolia, which again relieved the Chinese of any security related aspects on the northern borders, given the kind of trouble they've had during the 1960s. Number two is on multipolarity, as we just discussed on this issue on the United Front and the provision of space between the two countries in relation to the Security Council, in relation to SCO, BRICS. In SCO, the Russians and Chinese are almost at an equal level, which is a strategic gain for China because SCO is in Eurasia mainly, and in providing support for China on the Xinjiang related issues, on the three evils issues. Most important, the Chinese have had the organization named on one of their cities, Shanghai. And in terms of the budgetary contributions, 24% by the Russians, 24% by the Chinese would mean there is the balancing between Russia and China. So no power, Russia or China would gain much ground in terms of the SCO functioning. This is the reason why, while India approached the SCO for membership way back in 2004, it got its membership only in 2017, 2016. So that is and only after Pakistan was given membership in the SCO simultaneously. So we could see that happening between Russia and China on the SCO format. We also do not know the Russian coordination in terms of the East Asian Summit. While Russia would like to be, as Nivedita mentioned, to enhance its pivot towards Asia, and Russia is a part of the East Asian Summit meetings, this is still a black box on how exactly this Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific element is happening on the Russian front. The third aspect is the BRI. Putin had attended the summit meetings, the two summit meetings of the Belt and Road Initiative. One of the 6 roads is going towards China, Mongolia, Russia, and they plan to have some high-speed railways and other infrastructure projects. Nothing really has happened on that front, except that the Russian president had mentioned about BRI, the EU, Eurasian Economic Union, getting integrated with the BRI. Nothing again really happened because EU has a lot of tariff restrictions. Integration is actually a problematic, while the BRI intends to have more integration. So there is a structural problem on the front of integration between the two fronts. Nothing really happened on that. But Russians are clever. They have not admitted the Chinese into the CSTO or not allowed the Chinese to come any closer to the CSTO, which is the security organization in the Eurasian region. Economy is fine, but not security. That's the Russian message on the Eurasian front. The fourth aspect of the bilateral relations is arms, which Nivedita had mentioned. I would just flag here, one of the things the Chinese faced was the cushion when the Soviet Union was around in terms of the ABM treaty and INF treaty. Now that the Trump administration is removing all those, Bush administration removed the ABM and Trump administration, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Treaty, INF treaty. So the Chinese are now increasingly coming under the pressure to have a trilateral strategic arms reduction talks, which would bring in the Chinese into this whole format as previously the Soviets were. So this is a new concern for the Chinese in terms of the strategic arms related. Nivedita also spoke about the energy front. I wanted to add a small dimension here. in South China Sea, the Rosneft equity shares have increased substantially. Chinese don't like this, but they cannot put it substantially. Interestingly, the ONGC Videsh Limited is divesting many of these and putting it into the Rosneft, because the Chinese cannot wage a war on the Rosneft, while they can issue coercive diplomatic statements on the ONGC Videsh Limited, as it happened during Manmohan Singh's time. So this is one which is still unfathomable in terms of the Chinese position on the South China Sea and the Russian role, especially in relation to the Vietnamese control. Finally, in terms of the economic aspects, Nivedita also spoke about it, but I just wanted to give a rough comparison. The total trade between Russia and China is, as Nivedita mentioned, $80 billion last year. But if you compare the Chinese trade with other countries, $580 billion with the US, $530 billion with EU, $400 billion with Japan, $200 billion with South Korea, $420 billion with ASEAN. So major trading partners are not Russia. It's a very minor partner, $80 billion. With India, it's about $94 billion. So India and Russia are minor trading partners. Of course, for these countries, China is the largest trading partner. But most important, much of this trade is also in terms of the border trade. And this is also a troublesome feature between Russia and China. Russian Academy of Sciences made a survey, and they found that the number one threat they face is Chinese. Number two is US. Number two is Japan. Number three is US. In terms of perceptions in these local areas, in regional areas. So it's very different from what we generally view US as the number one threat for Russia and so on and so forth. That is problematic when it comes to the border trade and border. That's because there is a lot of migration from China to Khabarovsk, Krai and other areas, which is creating demographic troubles in the region. And I would also suggest that the Russian command in this area is getting beefed up in Far East, which is surprising. If they have strategic partnership, the Russian military should have been relatively more calming down, but their deployment patterns have increased in the Far East in relation to China related. Finally, I would suggest 2-3 things. One is United Front, which is very important for us to analyze the Chinese perspectives on Russia. The second most important thing, many of the Russian leaders have studied in Moscow, and many Chinese leaders have studied in Jiangzemin, various others. Of course, today the Chinese leaders send their children to Stanford, to Harvard and other places, but it is the Russian who have provided education for many of these leaders in China. One of the fears of Chinese is Russians know everything about China. That's the something which is in the background which troubles them. I did make several interviews with a lot of Chinese, so this factor comes in substantially, that the Russians know everything about China in terms of their leadership qualities, succession issues, and Russian analysis of Chinese issues are also very intensive from this perspective. So this is a fear. For example, the Russians have arrested the Chinese in the Northeast several times, and the Chinese don't complain. But when the Vietnamese do something about China, there is a whole lot of things on, or the Japanese do in relation to Senkaku Islands or in other areas. But when it comes to the Russian police arresting the Chinese for smuggling or other criminal activity, the Chinese don't make any statement regarding this. So it's very surprising that they keep hold on this. Finally, I would suggest the national interests of Russia and China differ substantially, although it is still a black box on how they are addressing these issues. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Shrikant. I mean, that was full of a lot of interesting historical detail. and I think gives us a perspective on the Chinese understanding and approach towards the relationship with Russia. Just as a small vignette, something that you said sparked off. The S-300s, which you're right, I mean, after the first batteries were deployed around Moscow, the next lot were deployed in the Russian Far East. The S-400s, the same practice. The first batteries around Moscow and the remaining in the Far East. So it'll be very interesting to see how the Russians deploy the S-500, which is supposed to come into the annual, into operation in the next couple of years. So will the deployment, I mean, Moscow is a given, obviously, but where the next deployment will be, would be of interest and indicative of Russian concerns. The second thing is, I think one aspect that we need to keep in mind is what Putin declared in October, that the Russians are helping China develop a more robust air defense system. Now, if you're doing an air defense system with another country, A, that country exposes a lot of its military thinking, but B, you are also exposing a lot of your military, not only thinking, but hardware capabilities and all. So there obviously is a certain comfort level that is developing between the two countries that we need to keep in mind. And now, of course, for the most eagerly awaited presentation on how India views all this.
Which is what Professor Kundapalli says is the black box. Well, thank you very much, Nandan, and I'm happy that you asked me to this brainstorming seminar, as you call it, and I really benefited from listening to the previous two presentations, because for an Indian understanding of the implications of the Russia-China relationship, I think it's important to actually see what is there on the ground. So for the purposes of what I'm going to say, I'd like to focus on the implications of the Russia-China relationship on three areas of India's core interests in terms of this relationship. One is the economy, the second is defense, and the third is something that we call connectivity. Which brings in aspects of Greater Eurasia, BRI, which have been mentioned, but I would like to look at these three areas. On terms of issues, I would like to look at the impact of the Russia-China relationship on the issue of the Indo-Pacific and on the issue of South and Central Asia. I, unfortunately, am too influenced by the American State Department merging of South and Central Asia, so I look at it in that context. And finally, in terms of their multipolarity or the multi-options that have been mentioned, as far as India is concerned, I think I'd like to look at two structured platforms in which we participate together. That's the United Nations and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, both of which have secretariats and institutions with charters and so on, and two informal platforms in which we interact. One is a new platform called the Russia-India-China Informal Summit platform. It's met twice so far. And the second is the G20 platform. Contrary to a lot of impressions, the G20 is still a very unstructured. It doesn't have a permanent secretariat. It carries its secretariat with its chairmanship. So these are what I'd like to look at. Now, in terms of the economy, and as has been mentioned, energy is a driver of the Russia-China relationship, and China is an avid consumer of energy, and especially from Russia, which is its neighbor. So the first implication that I look at is in terms of the availability and stability of Russian supplies of energy to India in the context of Russian supplies of energy to China. And here, I think the relevant experience that we keep in mind is a similar paradigm we entered into when we entered into the TAPI project, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India project, where the cabinet note said that we are going to get Turkmen gas from Daulatabad, but turned out that Daulatabad had already been committed by Turkmenistan to China. So in terms of the Russia-India energy relationship, and especially on natural gas from Yamal, which Nivedita mentioned, I think this is a point that needs to be kept in mind. The second part of our economic activity relates to the initiative that has been now taken between India and Russia on the Russian Far East. Because the Russian Far East, for the last 20 years at least, has been the stomping ground of China. And China, as Professor Kondapalli just mentioned, has aroused a lot of concerns among the local Russian population there. But China is a big investor. China's burgeoning population, which so far has been preoccupied with jobs within China, can at a drop of a hat move across the border into the Russian Far East if the economic conditions drive them or draw them into the Russian Far East. And this is something that for India is relevant because India is looking to the Russian Far East, and the initiative announced in Vladivostok in September is backstopped by a $1 billion line of credit. It's a comparatively large amount of money for India to commit to making a success of the presence of Indian small and medium enterprises in the Russian Far East. They will have to compete with China. And therefore, this is something that is relevant for us to look at in terms of the Russia-China engagement in this area in the Russian Far East. And of course, the interesting possibility of a possible coordination between India, Japan, and South Korea in the Russian Far East as a counter to China. That is something that I think is possible. And the third is a very peculiar area, which again relates to what Professor Kondapalli mentioned, which is the agreement at Vladivostok between India and Russia for the movement of workers into the Russian Far East. This is something that grabbed a headline or two when it was announced, but after that has subsided. But this is something that when we interact with our friends from Russia is in their mind that can India, with its demographic dividend and its demographic depth, provide a countervailing option to Russia to deal with this fear that exists within those local territories of Russia, all the way from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean, on being submerged by China. And therefore, is that one of the reasons for this agreement between Russia and India on movement of workers, temporary movement of workers into Russia? So that's the economic basket. In the defense basket, I'm glad that we talked about, I'd like to talk about three things. One is the S-400. Now, the S-400 is a symbolic development, both for Russia-China relations as well as for Russia-India relations. And I think that here for India, the important thing is what are the conditionalities regarding the S-400 deployment and use in the case of an eventual outbreak of hostilities between India and China? Are there conditionalities on the use of the S-400? I mentioned this because unlike other Russian defense systems which have been acquired in the past 15 years, which have been acquisition accompanied by transfer of technology and then manufactured in India, the S-400 is not going to be manufactured in India. So therefore, it is off the shelf, and therefore, are there end-user conditionalities on that? And of course, linked with that is the Russian experience of reverse engineering done to all their Sukhoi and one MiG aircraft by China, and the creation of a Chinese version of Sukhoi and MiG, which now finds itself in the Pakistan Air Force. So does the S-400 lead itself to reverse engineering? And if so, what are these implications, especially if it suddenly appears in a Chinese incarnation in Pakistan? This is something that I think will be of concern to us. The second is the missile attack early warning system, which was mentioned too. This is Russian assistance to China, and Nandan has also talked about it. But as an Indian, I would like to analyze and assess what will be the implication of this missile attack early warning system for the BrahMos missile, which India and Russia have jointly developed, along with Israel. So this is something that is, I think, of relevance. And the third area is the modernization of the People's Liberation Army rocket force. Now, this is something that China has been pursuing single-mindedly. And this is linked in a way with China's position on a new start, talks, new negotiations between the United States, Russia, and China on rocket missile deployment technologies. And the question for India is that India, with its own aspirations of being a rocket and space power, an emerging rocket and space power, are we willing to be on the side when these three countries come to the negotiating table and negotiate a new regime to replace the INF, which is now on the side? Is that an option for India? So moving to the third area of the bilateral relationship between Russia and China on connectivity issues, I think that Russia and China are, it seems to be pursuing separate strategies, although I take the point that at the high level of President Putin may have participated in the BRI summit and so on. But if you look at it on the ground, Greater Eurasia and the Eurasian Economic Union and the connectivity that implies is separate from the Belt and Road Initiative of China. And I think that in this regard, there are three specifics on the ground which are of interest to India. One is, again, the new focus that we have given after the Vladivostok summit, but even in the preparations for the Vladivostok summit, on the Northern Sea route in the Arctic. Now, Russia-China cooperation on the Northern Sea route is undermined by the continuing Chinese dispute over the application of the Arctic Council framework to this territory, because China does not want to be fettered. I mean, having gone through the UNCLOS experience in the South China Sea, China, I don't think, is keen to be fettered by the members of the Arctic Council, because like India, China is also a member, is an observer of the Arctic Council, but not a member of the Arctic Council. So this is the impact of India-Russia collaboration in using the northern northern sea route of the Arctic on a Chinese drag. Will that affect cooperation between India and Russia or not, is something that needs to be seen. The second is, although the BRI has one part going into Russia, but the fact is that most recently this year, China has prioritized the Trans-Caspian International Transportation Route, TITR, which it calls the Middle Corridor, and that bypasses Russia completely. So for India, the interesting question is whether that is actually a good thing for India, because if you look at it on the ground in Central Asia, most goods from India that reach the Central Asia market reach through China, reach through Shanghai. So is the connection between Shanghai and Central Asia and onwards into the Caucasus something of benefit to India, despite the concerns it may have in Russia, is worth looking at. And the third is the implication of the Vladivostok-Chennai maritime route, which was announced in the summit in September, on the whole issue of the Indo-Pacific and the South China Sea. Now, this is something, when it becomes operational, will involve Russia in supporting the freedom of navigation in the sea lanes of communication in the Pacific Ocean, and probably bring it closer on the ground with India against any attempts to restrict the free movement of shipping and navigation along the sea route, lane of communication, which goes through the South China Sea. And I think that that's an important aspect which we need to look at. Now, on the two issues, the Indo-Pacific, of course, we know that Russia and China do not agree with the legitimacy of this new strategic framework, which has been now endorsed by a large number of countries around the Indian and Pacific Oceans. For India, there is an issue which relates to the development of the commitment between India and Russia on cooperation in the maritime sector, specifically in the Indian Ocean. This is something that has been prioritized, and India has, in a sense, used Russian deep naval assets, nuclear submarines, for example, to augment its role as a net security provider in the Indian Ocean region. So how does that impact on the normative discussions on the Indo-Pacific, whereas on the ground we are actually cooperating more closely with Russia? And secondly, and as important, the main threat perception for maritime security is seen to be from China in the Indian Ocean. So while Russia and China may both diverge on the Indo-Pacific, on the ground, I would see a closer alignment between India and Russia in this maritime domain than with China. And the third area, which is an area which I think needs a lot more work to be done from our side, is this whole concept of developing the Indian maritime identity, which was articulated in March 2015, on two pillars. We have focused a lot on the net security and the militarization issue, on naval assets and drones and so on. But I think not much has been done on the other pillar, which was also part of the Indian policy announced in March 2015, which is the blue economy. The development of the blue economy, and here between Russia and China, Russia is, with its own tremendous experience on the blue economy, a much more credible partner, I would think, for India and for transforming India into the major power that she wants to become. The second set of issues, regional issues, and is linked with South and Central Asia. And here I think there are obviously three areas in this set of issues. One is Central Asia. There has been this consistent analysis of whether Central Asia is part of the Russian sphere of influence, or whether the Chinese have now upstaged Central Asia, upstaged Russia and Central Asia. And the subset of that is Afghanistan. Of course, Afghanistan was once a buffer between Central Asia and South Asia. Then it's become a bridge and probably may become a buffer again. So this whole issue of Afghanistan plays out. And in this, the Russia-China engagement has some relevance for India, because while the Chinese have not gone out of their way to involve India in decision-making on this region, I saw an interview, a televised interview publicly broadcast by Strategic News International of Zamir Kabulov by SNI, in which he has actually said clearly that Russia wants India to be a formal party to the Moscow process on Afghanistan. Now, that is something that, coming from him in a public televised interview, I think is worth looking at. And of course, this is something that also reflects on the aspirations of Central Asia as far as India is concerned. In Central Asia, in the context of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the support that India was getting for her membership of the SCO from Central Asian states was basically as providing a countervailing influence to both Russia and China. But for that, India-Central Asia relationship has to be completely transformed. And I think that I think I'm not among the optimists of that happening in the very near future. Now, moving on to the last section, which is the multilateral engagement. Of course, Russia and China coordinate in the Security Council, but both of them, I would say, are like the second incarnations, because neither Russia nor China are the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics or the Republic of China, which are the members of the Security Council in the UN Charter. Both these countries have moved into the membership because of historical reasons. The People's Republic in 1971 October and the Russian Federation in 1992 January, without amending the charter. I mean, so the short point of mentioning this is that the worldview that these two entities bring into the Security Council is different from the worldview of the Second World War, when they became permanent members of the Security Council. And I think we need to actually acknowledge this difference, that their interests are very different from the interests of being on the Allied side in June 1945. And where does this impact on India? One is, of course, on India's attempt to become a member of the Security Council, a permanent member. The word permanent is important only because it means part of the decision making. India is not wedded to the word permanent just as a status. It is because of what it means, and it means part of decision making. So do Russia and China support this? And I think that the evidence on the ground is neither of them support including any other country in decision making in the UN Security Council. So this is something that we need to factor into our policy on Security Council reform. The second is, of course, linked with the interest of the Security Council to be the primary multilateral institution to counter terrorism. And here India's own experience of being exposed, of being subjected to the Chinese veto, I think has made us look to other options. And one of the options that is being pursued, and I think probably this will be written about much more, is the current trend of the Security Council outsourcing its normative and its functional tasks to bodies outside the Security Council, specifically in this case, the Financial Action Task Force. Now, the FATF is something that is seen as providing some traction on meeting India's concerns on countering financing of terror in Pakistan. But most people probably are unaware that the Security Council, through its resolution, has already co-opted FATF recommendations into the text of Security Council resolutions. So, in a sense, they are also enforceable multilaterally because they exist as Security Council resolutions which all countries have agreed to implement under Article 25 of the Charter, UN Charter. And the third is a very new issue, but I think Russia-China relationship will impact on India on this issue, and that is the India-Pakistan question, which China brought up unilaterally on the 16th of August this year, as a response to our domestic legislation on Jammu and Kashmir on the 5th of August. And I think that here the lines are so far clear. The line taken by Russia is not only a emotional or a friendship line, but also a very legal line. And the Russian response is that this issue is to be resolved bilaterally on the basis of the Simla Agreement, which Russia, as a permanent member of the Security Council, sees as a bilateral treaty. Now, the Simla Agreement is a treaty which is registered, like a will is registered, a treaty is registered in the UN database under Article 102 of the Charter, and that's what Russia has emphasized. Whereas China, on the other hand, because probably it's a newer member of the Security Council, only from 1971 October, is going on reopening the India-Pakistan question and disregarding the Simla Agreement. So how does that impact on India? And this is a big challenge for India as India gets elected next June as a non-permanent member of the Security Council. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization, I think Russia-China interaction in the SCO has been shown, on the one hand, on the politics of the SCO, on the other hand, of trying to jostle for the economic cake of Central Asia. And as I mentioned, India is not going to be very impactful in this process. And I think that that's where it will stay. The Russia-India-China informal summit, I would look at in terms of the same interest of the Wuhan spirit, the Chennai Connect, and I would go to the Sochi summit. So India, Russia, and India, China have engaged in informal summit mechanisms in order to provide a flexible and real-time response to challenges that have come up. And I think the Russia-India-China, or RIC summit, which has met twice on the sidelines of the G20 summit, is probably going to occupy a similar platform for us to look at. But the issues they're supposed to discuss are still undefined. And even Foreign Secretary Gokhale's briefing after the Osaka meeting was very general. It had nothing specific. And the last is, of course, the G20. Now, this is linked with all the issues that were spoken of on the economic side. But there are three things that I would like to mention. One is the WTO reforms. This is something that has come out of the Russia-China India interaction on the G20 sidelines, that we are all committed to upholding multilateralism, and this fits in with China's leadership of economic multilateralism. So we must ensure that the WTO is not disintegrated or brought down by the current American attempt to destroy its dispute settlement system. The second is the impact of Western sanctions on Russia. I think the use of other currencies, other structures including the European-led impact structure, I think all that in the G20 context will impact on Russia-China cooperation and on India's participation in these alternate structures. And the third and most, I think, important, significant, and future-looking is the collaboration between Russia and China in the digital domain. This is something that I think is very critical for India because at the moment, while everybody looks at Huawei, the fact remains that in Russia, it's Samsung that dominates. South Korea has been a leader in this technological area in Russia for many years. Huawei, of course, is very big and has a huge presence all over the world. But the point here for India is that we are not, we have not researched or developed these technologies. How long can we be a bystander when even countries like Russia and China are probably poised to collaborate, not only in the technology, but also in the policies on how these technologies are used. You've seen the discussions in the United Nations where there's a polarization between Russia and China on one side and the United States and the democracies on the other side. And while India instinctively is on the side of the democracies, but on the ground there is a huge influence of companies from China in this area in India. So where does that leave us? I think these are the questions I pose. I'm sorry I have no answers, but that's the black box. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think Mr. Mukerji has genuinely raised many questions to which I actually was hoping that there would actually be answers. Before we move into the discussion, I have to make up something that I didn't do in the beginning. I want to quickly, although it's maybe a bit too late, but still introduce the panelists. Nivedita is a recent but valuable addition to ORF Strength. Nivedita is a junior fellow and she works on Russia. Srikanth, of course, does not need any introduction. He's one of India's foremost China experts, but don't just certify him as a China man as it is. He also has deep knowledge of the East Asian region in general. I have discovered, traveling with him, that he knows much intricate detail, is aware of much intricate detail about South Korea, Japan, and various areas there. And of course, Mr. Mukerji, again, doesn't need much introduction. Many of you know him as UN's permanent representative at India's permanent representative at the UN. But I have the luck of knowing him a little earlier when he, in his avatar as diplomat, a functioning active diplomat, was in Moscow as well as in Central Asia. So one is aware of his rich experience in these areas, which qualifies him, of course, to say all this. Now we go to a discussion, but before we go into the discussion, there are a couple of points. I am going to misuse my chair privilege and wanted to win. One is I have a serious problem with this whole notion of the Chinese invasion of the Russian Far East. Because whatever you say, whichever measure you take, the numbers don't match what we are hearing about the place. The second is the logic doesn't match. What is happening in the Russian Far East is it is an area that is becoming increasingly poorer. And migration normally takes place from poorer places to richer places. It is true that Chinese entrepreneurs are moving into this area. It is true that they are engaged in a lot of illegal smuggling. It is also paradoxically true what Srikanth mentioned, that in these areas, the Russians view the Chinese as the major threat. But if you look, the problem is partly corruption, partly political desires. It's the political leadership at the local level that is cooperating with Chinese money, because they need to be able to create jobs, need to be able to distribute a certain amount of largesse, and the Chinese are very good at providing that largesse. But the Russians have become aware of it. And the Russians, and I mean Moscow, the greater deployment of forces, they're particularly aware of the timber smuggling that is taking place. And steps, I think, will be taken or appear to be in the anvil, where the relationship in that area is going to become a little bit more let's put it, sort of institutionalized, legalized. Then the curious thing that, again, Shrikant mentioned, and I completely agree, is that the Russians, despite their rich history of sort of having Marxism and all, show a remarkable lack of understanding of economics. And this is true of the Soviets as well as of the current Russian leadership. They are driven primarily by a political vision of the world. And their one fundamental thing which I think is important for us to understand is their desire to securitize everything is because that is the way they see the world. Their strength is security and military, and they bring that to the table. So whatever they do, they view that through that prism. So I think we have to be able to understand that. So this desire to, in a sense, create a security apparatus within BRICS, they were the ones who started this conversation of the national security advisors. And it hasn't gone too far, and that is reflected in Mr. Mukerji's presentation, who very curiously named every single 3-digit, 4-digit, there were multiple combinations of letters, but forgot about the 5-digit BRICS. He just didn't mention it. So you can see that the Russian desire to securitize everything and all is having very, very little effect. I agree about BRI and Eurasian Union. In fact, again, a fact, the Russians are not formally supportive of BRI. They have signed that agreement through the Eurasian Union. And in fact, what upsets the Eurasian Union is that Putin declared it on his own in Beijing without even consulting Kazakhstan and Belarus. So that created bad blood within the Eurasian Union. The second thing the Russians are concerned about is that the Chinese have developed their own map in which there is a third route through the Arctic, which they call the Silk Arctic or whatever it is, and they've added it to BRI. Now, obviously, as a member of the Arctic Council, as well as a country that believes that the Arctic is sort of its extended lake, they are not going to take kindly to this. So there is going to be a certain source of tension. And again, to something provoked by Mr. Mukerji, India, South Korea, Japan, very attractive idea. But as long as Japan follows the sanctions policy against Russia, it's going to become very difficult to, convert that potential into any kind of reality in this area. And now with these, sorry I took so much time, but the floor is open for discussion. Let me also mention that the papers of all three presenters will be on our website after they take in this discussion and make whatever suitable adjustments. So it will be on our website by the month end, so you can always refer to them. And now, questions. Anyone? Yes, Mr. Goel.
Thank you, Nandan. I may sound rather I have a lot of skepticism about what is happening between Russia and China, but that is basically because of the long experience of having dealt with them earlier. And I may also sound rather ancient when I say these things. Let me preface with very important small remark. Chu Rumchi, when he was the mayor of Shanghai, and I sound very ancient, he had a lot of disdain for Russia at that time. And he said in a conversation, and I was present at that time, that Russia is trying to fix a rocket engine on a bullock cart. When they were talking about glasnost and perestroika, that indicated the kind of disdain they have. I have a sense that the disdain has not completely disappeared, which is reflected in the more or less one-sided relationship between not security, but economic relationship between China and Russia. The dependence of Russia on energy exports to China for its own economy is just one indicator of that, really speaking. So my question really is, in the whole process of growing Russia-China relationship, and I'm not really taking India as part of that equation because I don't think we really stand in that kind of a larger picture anywhere at the moment. So in this larger game between Russia and China, what actually is driving China towards Russia? My sense is that's basically because of Chinese global ambitions. And like Nivedita, you said, I think that essentially it is, they look at Russia as one country which can support them in that global ambition. Uh, who will ultimately emerge winner in this thing? Max, if you could comment on that later on, number one. And Shrikant, you also. Number two, what is the dynamics between Xi Jinping and Putin? Ultimately, the nature of leadership is important. Are they coming closer in terms of their own ambitions, global ambitions? And lastly, Eurasia. I would like to have a greater discussion on Eurasia because eventually it's not just BRI. Eurasia is one strategic area which seems to bring a lot of interplay between Russia and China. So I would like to have a greater, more detailed discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Goel. I mean, although those are 3 questions, but we will take 2 more questions. Karthik?
We can hear you.
Okay, anyway, no problem. My question is to Master Mukerji. How do the Russians view Sino relations? And particularly in the context of supplying military equipment to both countries, how do the Indians view the Russian move towards, which Nivedita did mention, of supplying advanced weaponry to China, particularly post-2014. How does that affect India-Russia relations, and have the Indians, to the best of your knowledge, conveyed that to Moscow? And do the Russians do, as a consequence, as a corollary to that, do the Russians just bifurcate the 2 issues and have India and Russia worked out a way in which they can work together without allowing Russia's ties with China to affect Russia's ties with India? So I'd like you to elaborate on that and what you think are the problems or the concerns that we have. Thank you.
Thank you, Karthik. Yes, please.
My name is Rajiv Saxena. I work in the area of cybersecurity extensively here. I really agree with Mr. Mukerji's conviction that the cyber world will be the next big play. And you may be aware that Russia has already created RUNet, and they are protecting all their digital assets in a very strict way. Number 2, the new development is like, we are having ambassadors. We are going to have what you call as cyber security ambassadors in the world. And I happen to meet out of the P5 countries, 3 ambassadors, and they have their own vision of how they are controlling their assets. Everybody is scared of China. They want to protect all the digital assets against the cyber wars which have been perpetrated by the Chinese in a very, very big way. So, this is just the point of view. I would like to ask a question to the Kodapalli sir, whom I respect a lot, and I've been totally following him. Will the Chinese allow their own social media platforms to go global? And what is their cyber security policy, which you would like to initiate right now? And are the Russians aware of the power of the Chinese supremacy as far as the cyber security is concerned?
Okay, we'll take one last question in this round, then we'll go on. Pinak?
I was persuaded to come into this because in this whole discussion we have not really factored in a major player, which is the USA, and how it sees all these developments that are taking place. And I would like to refer to a recent essay by Fareed Zakaria in the Foreign Affairs Journal, where he talks about why USA should not be scared of China. I mean, it's something to that effect. Yeah. And there he talks about, I mean, after detailing everything that has happened, etc., the usual way, he talks about that the USA should follow a policy of engagement and deterrence. Now, you can interpret this in so many ways, but I don't think he is actually. Engagement, we know, I mean, the engagement that is there. But what are the new tools of deterrence that the USA would like to use if it accepts this kind of policy? So it's an area where one can really think about and speculate as to. But let us not forget that this relationship is, both of these countries are actually keeping an eye on the USA as to how the USA will react to this growing relationship. China, given China's, given Russia's, let's say, a DNA towards the European, sort of to become more a European kind of a power, and the natural gas relationship with Europe. So I don't think Russia is going to put all its eggs into the Chinese basket. There's no way Russia will do that. And I think, and if somehow the new president or even Trump, by the way, I think understands this because he's been trying desperately to convince the constituencies in the USA, let's get away from sanctions on Russia. Let's do something, because they don't want this relationship to go beyond a particular point. So I leave it at that, but I'd like to hear the opinion of the panelists.
Okay, Shrikant, you start. Then Mr. Mukerji, Nivedita escaped in this round.
On the issue of who benefited in Russia-China relations, I think both benefited substantially. The multilateral institutions have provided to be a kind of a wall against any American encroachments. It did provided space for Russia and China on this. But I think the winner here is China. There was this Gilbert Roseman's book on Chinese perspectives on the Soviet disintegration. And one of the things he cites is about Deng Xiaoping saying, look at Soviets, they disintegrated because they have no economy, no consumer durables and others. And so his policy of Tao Kuang Yang Hui, the keeping a low profile, began. So I think if they are now the second largest economy, it's partly because of this. And they were able to protect on the Russian front, they were able to protect on the American front. Of course, today they have a new policy of becoming a global superpower. So that's the reason why Trump had initiated so many, as Ambassador Pinaki had mentioned, the deterrence, on the deterrence portion. First was the ARIA, the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act in January this year. Second is the new Indo-Pacific idea with Pompeo suggesting $60 billion investment in the quality infrastructure projects. The third is the Uyghur aid bill. And the fourth is the Taiwan arms transfer. And South China Sea, the FONOPS, and the bomber flights, overflights. I mean, that is denying the Chinese the territorial, things on the South China Sea islands. If you look at the map of China, the deterrence is in place. On Tibet, again, the Dalai Lama succession, there is the new, the senator's suggestion on China will not be allowed to have the say on the 15th Dalai Lama succession. So you look at all the, on global commons, cyber, space, maritime, in all these there is that deterrence also visible. So I think that explains partly. On Eurasia, the Chinese role here is mainly in the economic field, the four major energy pipelines. But if you look at the Central Asian, Eurasian energy industry, it is dominated by the Russians. It is just the pipelines, some drilling operations by the PetroChina and others. but essentially it is dominated by the Russian industry, energy industry in Eurasian region. So the thing that the Chinese are going for, Central Asia on energy, it is still dominated by the Russians. So still it is marginal on that front. Second, the trade between Central Asia and China is cumulatively it's not more than $80 billion, the total trade with Russia as well. The Chinese penetration in Central Asia is quite high at the moment, but still in terms of the economic leverages, it is still the Russians who play a bigger role in terms of their diaspora, in terms of their industry, in terms of their military hold through the CSTO. So cumulatively, while China made entry into Central Asia, Eurasian region, it is still the Russians who have substantial stakes in the Central Asian. I would say this. On the arms transfer military technology, Russians are not transferring strategic technologies to China, except in the last Su-35 incident and also in terms of the S-400. Except these two, they have not transferred any strategic technology. What are strategic technologies? They have not transferred air refueling for pan theater movement. They have not transferred the air refueling technologies. They have not transferred the AL-31F or AL-41F engines, turbofan engines. What they have done is they have sold 450 units. Like we purchased the GE404, no technology transferred there, but no license production as well, because they did the license production for the Su-27, and they also had a new version of this Su-27 in Shenyang aircraft factory. So what they have done is not even a joint production, joint manufacturing of the AL-31F. That's a strategic technology because the Chinese have no turbofan engines. Of course, the JF-17 have the AL-31F. 4 of them had transferred to Pakistan. So that's our concern as well on the third area of strategic technologies. They have not transferred in the nuclear or ballistic missiles, except the RD-98 engine, where they got some systems or technologies, but not the whole platform. This is for the ICBM projects, which the Russians have not cleared, the RD-98 engines. So on strategic technologies, there is no headway. In fact, the Russian technology transfers to India. The MKI is better than MKK, the Su-30 MKK. Of course, it also has the Israeli head-up display and aviation technologies. So in some, the strategic technologies have not been transferred by the Russians. So they are clear on this. Conventional, yes. Strategic, no, from the Russian side to the Chinese. On cyber security issues, I was a student in China for 3 years in the 90s. And at the time, we were desperate to call up home. And most of the telephones were controlled by the Russian technology. Everything in the 90s, early 90s was all Russian technology. So all these Russian mafia, they were there. And Hemant was here. We were all part of that. So there were these Russian mafia who would fix you. You can call for hours to your home, on these technologies, telecom. But today, the Chinese have the modern technologies, the strategic telecom areas, they were able to outsmart the Russians on this. But core technologies still are the Russians. So they developed the advanced ones and then were able to get into this. So Russia is concerned about this leapfrog the Chinese made because of their mixture with the Taiwanese, Japanese, and Korean technologies in the telecom area. And also from the US and European, some of the Nokia, Motorola is taken over by the Chinese company. So on cyber related issues, the Russians are concerned And so they have a very Great Wall kind of thing with the Chinese. They don't allow many of the Chinese social networking sites or many such, so they are concerned about it.
I think Professor Kondapalli's answered most of the questions, but on that one on China, Russia, India, and compartmentalization that you asked, I think to the best of my knowledge and in the public domain, I do not think these concerns have actually been raised in the bilateral India-Russia framework. But it is a matter which analysts and strategic thinkers here and elsewhere are raising all the time on the impact of Russia-China collaboration in defense on India and India-Russia collaboration. But there's one small, one difference which has come up much more prominently after September, which is the Russian policy now to participate in defense manufacturing in India. And if you look at that agreement on the spares, I think that is a harbinger of what lies ahead, where you will have Russian investments in Indian manufacturing units to manufacture spares and defense equipment for the Indian armed forces. And there, I don't think China is actually a player or a factor. On who will prevail, Suresh, you know, this depends on a country which you know better than me, which is China. I think China's ambition is that it will prevail. But whether China can prevail by itself or in conjunction with a group or a partner or more than one partner, I think that will depend as much on what Pinnock raised, which was the United States and its allies. So it depends on the sector. If you're talking of energy, then Russia and Saudi Arabia are more compatible than Russia and China. China and India are, in that sense, in the same basket. We are both importers, but they are the exporters, and today they control the prices because of this understanding, the transactional diplomacy that has prevailed in West Asia. So now you have an understanding between Russia, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Iran for other reasons as well. So the producers of energy are all on one side, and China and India are on the other side. And that's a very interesting commentary on that area. Defense, the Russians are so far ahead, but for how long will they remain ahead is a question. And I think there the India-Russia experience is actually quite interesting, because the first time the new defense technologies which were developed by post-Soviet Russia were actually used and operationalized were in the case of the Indian armed forces. The stealth frigates, the first time they came to India, the T-90 that came to India, the Sukhoi 30 MKI came to India, the BrahMos came to India. So these are the new technologies for which India has proved to be a launching pad for Russian technologies, which they themselves did not have at that time because they didn't have the defense budget to acquire it. Today, Russia has more resources and is funding its defense much more aggressively. So it will have that. But at that time, it was retrieving the situation from the chaos of the Yeltsin years, where there was no priority for defense. So this is something that I think is important. And on cyber, which Rajiv you mentioned, I think that's important because part of the current move, which is led by Russia, and in the UN General Assembly at least, there's a resolution which has been adopted, is to begin negotiations on an international framework for cyber space. Now, that resolution has been adopted by a vote. India voted with Russia in that. And I think if we move this issue forward a bit like 1967 for the maritime domain, we are at that stage today in the cyber domain. In 1967, the first steps were taken, which eventually led to the creation of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, UNCLOS. So for cyber, probably we are at that stage today, where the new resolution provides the platform for discussions, which may go on for many years, but eventually the outcome of that is a negotiated international legal convention.
Can I just one debate? There is a new convention which has been recently initiated by Vietnam, and that draft is in circulation. Unfortunately, because of other commitment, I couldn't read it for the last 10 days. But that's a new development, and that will also be a part of the discussion
Well, for the moment, I'll allow this intervention. Otherwise, my Stalinist tendencies were about to erupt. Any more questions? Yes, please, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. I'm Ambassador of Turkey. Would it be possible to elaborate a bit more about China, Chinese and Russian approach from Afghanistan? Because this is one of the areas which you have concentrated Mr. Ambassador. All of us in this room know that neither Russians nor the Chinese were happy with the presence of ISAF at their doorstep for different reasons. After ISAF, neither of them are happy with the resolute support mission. But although neither of them are happy, they are happy because of the presence of resolute support mission and previously before that the ISAF. Because the violence and terrorism that may emanate from the Afghan territory would directly affect the security and stability in Western China or Russia. I think this is one of the topics that bring together Russia and China in the global both diplomatic and foreign policy scenes. But on the other hand, even if we suppose that tomorrow resolute support mission would terminate in Afghanistan, then both the capitals would go into panic. How do you read this I mean, this question goes to all the three panels. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. I have just a supplement to what Ambassador Mukerji referred to Huawei and the Russia. I agree with you that now Samsung is dominating Russian market, but I think that is not the real issue. The worry is Huawei, the G5 they developed. Actual its implication we can see only when the AI applications come down, and we are not sure at which stage or which country that breakthrough can come. It may be in Singapore or it may be in India. But our software prowess haven't led to many things. That is one black area still we have. So the Chinese are going ahead with their own process of AI technology and applications. But the other point is many Chinese companies are investing in Indian market. So where we will stand if the real crunch comes? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Simon. I work at the French Embassy. We've spoken of S-400, of the Sukhoi, etc. But is there any kind of development in the maritime sector, in the naval sector between Russia and China, whether it be on the operational front, like training, or on the front of equipment, that could have implications for India? I would be glad if you could comment on this. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
my question is to Mr. Nivedita Kapoor and to you, sir. What have Russia and China contributed on in the domain of cryptocurrency and blockchain technologies? Because this is a disruptive technology that came up in the late 2000s, and I believe this is something that could be a tipping point. What are your views on it?
Well, I'm beyond questioning, so I assume this is a question to Mr. Mukerji. So, Nivedita, start.
Afghanistan is one of those areas where I would see that Russia is more active at the international front. Like you've seen in the case of the Middle East, it's Russia that has taken lead in Syria, in striking this deal between Syria and Turkey. So it is Russia that is more visible on the international front. Similarly, like with the Moscow format of talks, it is Russia that has begun these consultations, even though its position has not always coincided with that of India. I'll leave that to Mr. Mukerji to elaborate. But here we do see even though Russia has sort of taken a lead, it does consult with China regularly. They have regular talks, China, Pakistan. So on the Afghan format, they have been talking to each other. They haven't, I'm not aware of Russia and China publicly coming together out on Afghanistan on particular, like sort of explaining their position or something, but regular consultations have been happening on that front. In terms of cryptocurrency, blockchain, I'm sorry, I have absolutely no idea whether Russia and China have done anything together, but I'll study it, and if I find something, I'll be happy to email it to you.
On China, Afghanistan, the Chinese basic interest is obviously no connection between Uyghurs and the Al-Qaeda and the Taliban related. Second, China's interest in this is in terms of representative government in Kabul. The Chinese view is that the current government is not representative of all the ethnic factions, and hence they suggest to, so that is the second issue they have. So basically what they were suggesting is the Pashtun element needs to be given space in the government. Third, the Chinese also have been working with the Taliban. In November 2000, the Chinese ambassador to Islamabad, Lu Shulin, met with the Mullah Umar along with some researchers in Kandahar. This was the first meeting between them, and China's position is that the Taliban should have some space in the government in Kabul, and they play this card. The fourth position is, of course, peaceful transition, reconstruction, in which China has to have a role in the reconstruction aspects. So it's similar like the Iraq reconstruction efforts, where they demand for the different projects on this. That's a fourth. So when 9/11 happened, they mobilized 24,000 troops in Wakazir corridor, which separates the Xinjiang region to Afghanistan. One of the reasons is the Uyghur connection. In Fatah region, the Uyghurs were trained by the Al-Qaeda, and the Chinese official estimate is about 3,200 of these were trained by the Al-Qaeda. And so they wanted the ETIM, East Turkestan Islamic Movement, to be listed in the counter as part of the post 9/11 consensus on the counterterrorism. So that is one factor. The other thing why they mobilized forces was the Badakhshan was producing a lot of poppy, and there is a poppy opium. Although China receives 94% of its opium from Myanmar and about 4 to 5% from Afghanistan, but Badakhshan reported more poppy cultivation. So there is the poppy small arms connect in terms of their entry to Andijan, Fergana Valley, and to Kashgar. That's where the trail is traced. So that's the overall concern for the Chinese. So what the Chinese are doing in terms of the, so they proposed they supported the Istanbul process. They invited the Qatar-based Taliban group. Some members have gone, and there was the last year, or rather early this year, Russian and American interactions with the Taliban created some sense, but of course Zalmay Khalilzad's view has not prevailed, and so we are back to again square one. The second plan the Chinese have is the quadrilateral, China, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. That is another format they are also trying to put together. A third initiative is the Wuhan meeting between Modi and Xi Jinping, where they mentioned about one of the 5 aspects of that is on Afghanistan that they announced in Wuhan, which includes India and China doing some iron and steel exploitation in Bamiyan and other areas. There is this view that Afghanistan is sitting on some $3 trillion of minerals or resources. So India and China could tap into those. So there was So one of the Wuhan suggestions was India and China working together in Afghanistan. Nothing really happened except for training some diplomats at the FSI. So it is still, because India and China do not control the ground situation in Afghanistan. So that's the Chinese view on Afghanistan. So basically stability in Xinjiang, no connect between Uyghurs and the Al-Qaeda, because they also found that some of the Uyghurs who are taken back to Abu Ghraib also belong to the Uyghurs. And so Chinese claim that these are Chinese citizens, and so that's the connect. What are the Russian naval platforms to China? It includes Kilo class, 8 so far, 16 in all, and some with the AIP, air independent propulsion systems. The newer ones have the AIP. The second major naval platform transferred was the Sovereignty class destroyers, huge ones. 4 of them transferred, and then others are also in pipeline on this. The third is, of course, Varyag, which is, of course, came from Ukraine, but as part of the Soviet, which is now refurbished as Liaoning aircraft carrier. So that is a third platform, major platform. But also various systems, the ship-to naval missiles. There are so many projects that they have been working on. Many of their destroyers obviously are the Soviet design, vintage designs, but they are now also getting stealth technologies from Russia on this front. I do not recall any other platform on this. CIPRI mentions about those between Russia and on cyber. Russia and China's position is identical in the BRICS. Russia and China are proposing control over internet, which India is resisting in the BRICS declarations, because it has implications for civil society and NGOs and other things. So on that front, finally on Chinese migration to the northeast, far east of Russia, the figures are between 300,000 to 400,000, 3 lakh to 4 lakh Chinese. Local business do invite them because of the labor shortage. But this is a demographic concern, because many of them are intermarrying into the Russian society and claiming legislative rights, meaning voting, and like the Bangladeshis do in Assam. So something of that sort.
Well, Ambassador, in response to your question on Afghanistan, I think we need to also remember that from July 2011, China and Russia have actually coordinated themselves on the end game in Afghanistan when they joined the consensus to take out the Taliban from the Al-Qaeda sanctions list, with the view to reintegrating the Taliban into the political process in Afghanistan. So without the concurrence of China and Russia, this would not have happened. And we are today seeing the end result of that. The second is the focus on Afghanistan. As far as China is concerned, Professor Kondawali has mentioned about the Uyghurs and Xinjiang. As far as Russia is concerned, of course, they have traditional interests in the ethnic minorities which are non-Pashtun in Afghanistan, and these are the Tajiks, the Uzbek, and to a lesser extent the Turkmen. So with the Tajiks, of course, everything is much more well known in the public domain, with the military facilities in Tajikistan, the air base, and so on. The Uzbeks, you would be better placed than me, because the Uzbeks from time to time go to Turkey and then come back recharged for engaging within Afghanistan, with Rashid Dostum still playing a role. And the Turkmen are the mavericks. No one knows what the Turkmen will end up doing. So the problem for Russia is that if they are able to maintain a situation within Afghanistan which is a pot on the boil, then that will keep the Central Asians preoccupied and prevent the Central Asians from influencing the security of Russia do not forget that there's a huge Central Asian workers' diaspora in Russia, which the Russians are always looking at in terms of their being radicalized or they're becoming foot soldiers for any terrorist or radical activities within Russia. So the Central Asians today, they have become a point of concern. And of course, in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, Russia and China have actually cooperated on Afghanistan on the issues which Professor Kondapalli mentioned, which is preventing drug trafficking, preventing small arms transfers, and on preventing radicalization. But the effectivity and effectiveness of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization with the participation now of Pakistan as a full member is, I think, now open to question, because unless you have some reform within Pakistan of its sponsorship, official sponsorship of radical groups and unofficial sponsorship of these mafia groups of drug traffickers and small arms traffickers, I don't think this is going to make an effect. In reference to your question on the Chinese and in the cyber sort of sector in India and other options, I think at the end this will actually be decided by the cost. And the cost of so far of Chinese cyber technologies and products in India is much cheaper than the cost of the other. Even on 5G, that is the card that the Chinese are playing. But for India, there's one dimension which probably is unique as a market, which is that since 2015-16, we have now invested so heavily in digitizing our governance, our delivery of services, etc., that we now cannot only go by the intellectual discussion of moral discussion of what is good for us and what is bad for us, but we have to actually be also aware of making the Digital India initiative work, because on that will depend outcomes of our electoral processes in the next few years. So this is something that China, I suppose, knows better than most other countries and will leverage to its advantage. There and and there's a whole new universe which Rajiv knows about of artificial intelligence, robotics, Internet of Things. I mean, there's a jargon, of course, but the short point is that there's a new industrial revolution. And for India, this is the big question. Are we going to be continuing as techno coolies, which we were in the previous telecom revolutions, or are we going to become actually players with our own patents and our own products? That is the big challenge for us in the future. You've got a reply to your question from Professor Kondapalli, and I think that there's one small dimension to it, but which is relevant since you are from France, and that is the peculiar role that Ukraine plays in the transfer of arms and technologies which are of Soviet origin to other countries. And that is linked with Ukrainian internal politics itself, which is so far dominated by the oligarchs until the most recent president has come. But the oligarchs control that, and the oligarchs control it in Russia as well. So there is a understanding, which you know better than me, between the oligarchs. But they tend to dominate in this sector. And if the benefits and profits are coming to them from trading with China, so be it.
Thank you very much. If I may add to Nivedita's question, the Russians are interested in cryptocurrencies. Aditya was asking that. In fact, President Putin had a couple of years ago virtually publicly endorsed Ethereum as a currency, but that never took off. Sberbank, the largest bank in Russia, is working on developing a currency, electronic, and it claims that German Gref, the head of Sberbank, says that they're not far from achieving their goal. They, of course, have, if they would want to, access to Durov's Telegram currency, but since Telegram is proscribed, I don't think there is chance of them ever going that direction. But unlike everyone else, the Russian state is not taken a position that it is against cryptocurrencies. I think it is in a state, in a position where it wants to evaluate the possible impact. And I suspect that impact is going to be evaluated not from an economic point of view, but from a security point of view first. So you can see in which direction that is likely to head. The other thing is that I wanted to add to that question of naval platforms. The Russians are very clear in their mind that whatever naval platforms they transfer to China or naval technologies, and there are some that they have transferred, undoubtedly, these are those that China cannot use much beyond its shores. So even independent propulsion submarines are not those that China is likely to deploy, let's say, in the Indian Ocean. It's not likely to arrive on permanent deployment to places in Ambantota or anywhere else. But the Chinese are more inventive, and they have started their own design revolution in a sense, where they are developing systems which would allow them to enhance the capabilities of the platforms that they're getting from the Russians. So that is something, of course, the Russians can't control. The other factor in Russia's mind when they sell military hardware to China, including that is an important aspect that was mentioned by Ambassador Mukerji about the oligarchs. One of the compulsions to sell to China is that inside the system, the oligarchs want the money, and they are pushing the state to sell so that that money comes into this. And their argument is, this is the window of opportunity. After another 2 years, China will have it on its own, so we won't be able to do it. See, so let us grab whatever we can, because the Chinese are there in any case. So it doesn't really matter. You're not giving them anything that they're going to use to develop something else. So, it's a bit of both. Anyhow, thank you very much for your active participation. Thank you to the presenters. I thought very informative, educative. I definitely took away a lot, and I've enriched my understanding of Russia-China relations. I am sure that you will give me your papers, now I'm sounding Stalinist, very, very soon, and we will be able to everyone's delight, put it on our website so that everyone can have a look at them. Thank you very much.